Wow, this is our first virtual speaker this evening. I have to say I'm really excited about it. And Marcel Stieber spoke for our club last year in May, if you recall. Some of you probably recall. He spoke about the ArcNet down in the South Bay, and I was really happy that he was able to come up to Lafayette from the South Bay. And of course, Marcel is a frequent speaker at Pacificon, so you probably know all about him. And he's gracious to join us tonight for our first virtual meeting with the speaker on APRS. So thanks, Marcel. AI6MS, I'm going to hand it off to you. Go ahead.
All right, thanks very much, Ed. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the meeting, and thanks for having me here. We're going to be talking about APRS tonight, what it is, how to get started, and why you should care. And we are recording this portion of the meeting, just FYI. I'm also putting in the Zoom chat real quick. A link to the presentation slides is at my QRZ website, so if you want to go there and download the slides to follow along, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll be presenting them here throughout the meeting. A couple quick Zoom meeting recommendations. So if everyone can stay on mute during the meeting, that would be great. If you have your cameras on, that's really helpful because then I can see at least 25 of your beautiful faces at once and know if anyone's falling asleep or if I'm speaking too quickly or too slowly, or if you have something else to get my attention to, you can just wave at me. Please put your questions into the chat. So the Zoom group chat should be on the bottom of your screen. There should be a little chat button that you can click, and that'll open up the chat window. Feel free to drop questions in there during the presentation, and I'll get to those. And same for any comments. If you want me to repeat something or have any other questions, I can quickly address those. And then, yeah, we'll be recording the talk. And then I like to do a quick show of hands. So for anyone that is on right now, how many people know what APRS is? Just show of hands. And then keep your hands up if you own an APRS transmitter of some form. Okay, how many people have run an APRS Digipeater? Still some hands stay in the air, right? So you've got a great group here. So if you ever have any questions after this meeting, look for those people that kept their hands up, and I'm sure they'll be happy to address further questions. So quick background on myself. My name is Marcel Stieber, AI6MS. I was licensed in 2008 as KI6QDJ when I was a student at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, where I got my master's in electrical engineering. I'm still very much involved in the Cal Poly Amateur Radio Club. I still wear their t-shirts to all my club presentations, especially on Zoom. I'm involved with the Cupertino Aries group down in the South Bay as their repeater trustee and one of the assistant emergency coordinators. And I'm involved with a number of other groups as a communications consultant and tower climber and RF technician. I started playing with APRS back in 2009. This picture is from around that era. And if you'll notice on my back, there's a little yellow box there. And that yellow box is one of these transmitters, APRS transmitters that I had while I was running this jet ski for the Wildflower Triathlon. So it's always fun to see the different applications that we use, but we'll get into all of that right now. All right, so this presentation we'll start with a very elementary introduction to APRS. Then we'll talk about kind of common applications, what you would do with it. Spend some time on initial configuration, and then go to potential equipment recommendations and kind of how you can get started yourself. I like to call this a bidirectional QSO, or QSO, which is ham radio speak for a conversation. So please do ask questions in the chat. Just let me know, and we'll try to address those as we get through. All right, 3 sections. What is APRS? What are all these settings, and how do I get started? So let's jump right in. So first question, what is APRS? And we'll just get this one out of the way because it's often a common question. What does it stand for? The technically correct term is the Automatic Packet Reporting System, which is technically what it's referred to, but typically people knew it as Automatic Position Reporting System. So depending on who you ask and who wants to be pedantic about it, they will point out one or the other. Technically, packet is more correct because APRS is used for a lot more than just positioning. And it's really a packet system. So that's just to get that out of the way. So we'll think about it as an automatic packet reporting system that you can use to send packets all around the place. All right, so what's the point? The high-level point of APRS is to provide situational awareness for radio amateurs. So that is who is near me, what is near me, what's happening near me, and what sort of frequencies I should be listening on. So that can mean that you have a call sign near you. You want to see if some other station is near you. You want to see if there's a repeater nearby, a repeater whose frequency you could then dial in because you saw it on the APRS map, for example, and then, oh, that might be close to me, maybe I can talk to it, right? So those are sorts of things that you can do with APRS. So what can we do with it? Well, location, right? We talked about position. So that one's very commonly used. So location of your cars, of your motorcycles. If you're running an event, maybe the location of your rest stops, maybe the location of your EOC during an emergency, your emergency operations center, or your fire trucks or the ambulances for your event. So all sorts of things where it's useful to know where it is. You might want to use APRS from the positioning perspective to tell you where it is. The other really useful thing is telemetry. And for telemetry, that's anything where you're trying to measure something that you're not next to. So that could be weather stations telling you how hot, how windy, how humid. It could be the battery levels of your off-grid solar site. It could be the door status of your shed in the backyard or of the radio vault that you have on the hillside to know if someone's gone inside and opened up the door. And those are actually very common uses for not necessarily APRS specifically, but generally telemetry for radio sites. The third one is kind of station information. So this is something where you can present like repeater frequencies or the PL tones, the private line tones that you need to use to connect to the repeater, or to put up your club website and let people that are driving through the area know what your club website is where they can find out more information. And it can also be helpful for real-time messaging or announcements. So you can send out a local packet that says, hey, there's a club meeting tonight. And if you're in the area and they're listening to that channel, they would get that packet that says, hey, go tune to this Zoom frequency or this ATV frequency and watch the meeting or participate or come to this address and come to the club meeting. So that's pretty cool. So how does it work? So APRS uses packets, so these are digital packets of ones and zeros that are transmitted on a normal FM channel, so a normal amateur radio audio channel, analog audio channel. They use this thing called AFSK, or audio frequency shift keying, to actually encode these bits into a packet. So it's based on the old Bell 202 modem style. That's the old modem system using an AX25 protocol, which if you want to learn more about it, I've got an appendix that my friend wrote his whole thesis on the disambiguation of the amateur radio, the APRS system. So it's a pretty interesting deep dive if you're so inclined to learn more. But fundamentally, it sounds something like this, and hopefully we have the audio not too loud. This is what an APRS packet sounds like. And one more time, just for good measure. So that's it. So that's a typical kind of shorter APRS packet. And you can kind of hear there are two tones in there. That's how it's modulating. And in the United States, that's typically on 144.39 megahertz. And that's the kind of the standard APRS frequency that everyone uses in the United States, which is great. So if you pull out your handheld radio and you program in 14439, you'll almost guaranteed in any populated area start hearing packets, which is really kind of cool. And then you just need a way to actually decode those, but we'll get into that later. This picture is really neat. This shows an actual waveform, and you can see the two different frequencies, right? Because we're frequency shift keying. So the actual modulation type, you can see the lower frequency here, then the higher frequency, then a lower frequency, then a longer period of higher frequency, and then a longer period of lower frequency. So if you translated this to ones and zeros, it'd be like 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, for example. So that's actually how you visualize that packet, and then you can decode it and figure out what it is. I wouldn't recommend doing it this way. I'd recommend using a, a decoder, but that's kind of interesting. All right, so a little bit of vocabulary before we jump into the talk. Trackers is the first term we'll use a lot. So this is an APRS station with a GPS receiver attached to it that moves around. So that's something that you'd use for position reporting, something that you can use that global positioning system to track an object. Then there's the term Digipeater, which is a digital repeater, very similar to the repeaters you used with your handheld radio. This one's for digital packets that we're using for APRS, and we'll talk about those quite a bit more in this presentation. And the nice thing about these is they're usually on mountaintops or somewhere with a better antenna and a better radio that you can increase your range and talk to a larger area for greater situational awareness. Then there's an iGate or internet gateway. This is kind of a listening post that's attached to the internet that takes your packets or any packets that it hears and sends them to the APRS IS information servers, where it actually stores those packets and makes them available for anyone in the world to see. So you can go to websites like aprs.fi, Foxtrot India, and that will show you all the APRS that makes it to the internet. So it has to make it to one of these internet gateways to show up there, but it's a great way to kind of remotely check on things that you're not next to. And that's, yeah, APRS Internet Systems. We talked about that there. That's that connection of servers. And then the last one is what's known as a terminal node controller. And just like anyone that does packet radio, this is some form of little box that plugs in between your radio and your computer or your device that you're using to look at the packets, and helps you demodulate those packets. So you can turn that squawking noise in your radio into actual readable packets that you can do something with. All right, we talked about Digipeaters. That's about it. Any questions so far from part one? That's the intro. Okay, and just drop them into the chat. We'll get to them. I think most of them are already getting addressed. Part two, what are all these settings? So don't worry, I'm not going to talk through all of this. What's in a packet? There were some questions earlier. A packet, again, is this sound, this squawk that you hear on the radio that is a series of things that are encoded. So this first figure here, 5.1, this is from my friend's thesis that dives into all the technical details, and that tells you exactly what's in there. But realistically, the more useful one is this kind of human readable line in the middle, which starts with a call sign. We can recognize that, W6TDM-2. That's the Cupertino Aries repeater. And then some actual readable text here. So APOT30, wide 1.1, some weird characters, W6IA, that's a call sign. We recognize that. Here's a latitude and longitude. So that's a GPS coordinates. That's probably where this station is or where it's telling us that it is. And then we have a voltage here, 12.1 volts, a temperature, and a website. Very useful. So this packet is what would come straight off of your terminal node controller, your TNC, and that's something that you could do action on right away. You could see that and read it and say, oh, great, my repeater's at 12.1 volts, it's at 76 Fahrenheit, and if I want to find out more information about this station, I can go to that website, which is pretty cool. Down here, this is what an actual packet looks like a little bit longer. You'll notice this first portion, it's a whole bunch of ones and zeros in a row. That's known as the preamble. And that's what's used to kind of hop on the air and say, hello, I'm here. And then the actual data is this munge on the right, and then a brief tail here as well, just to say that it's finished, right? So very similar to any other packet format for those packet nerds out there. Same type of thing. The preamble is really used to make sure that the TNC knows what to listen for and that can decode that properly. Alrighty. So how do we set this all up? So in APRS, the most confusing thing when people first get this is they get this screen to configure their radio and they go, I have no clue how to configure this. I don't know where to start. So we're going to go through kind of the 5 most common sections that you just need to know what they are for and how to fill them out. And we'll give you common recommendations for what to fill in for each of those. So we'll go through these 5 here on the screen: call sign, SSID, the APRS symbol, path routing, the interval, and then the actual content or the message that's in your packet. So we'll start working through those. Okay, so first one, call sign and SSID. So this is what it sounds like. It's your call sign, and then it's a dash with a number behind it. So the call sign is pretty standard. You would just use your call sign. And then you can use the numbers 0 through 15 as a suffix. And that's great because I might have multiple trackers that I own, but I only have one call sign. So if I want to have my car is AI6MS-1, I could have my motorcycle as AI6MS-2, and maybe I want my weather station as AI6MS-7 or something else. And that's just a great way to have multiple stations that you're in control of. You're still the control operator for all of these, but you can have up to 16 with that call sign, which is great. Fun fact, you can get your vanity call sign plates with those suffixes as well, and that's a great way to label multiple vehicles with your call sign. I had a friend that did that. So the second bullet here, you can follow these guidelines. So there are some standards that are recommended for what these 0 through 15 map to. So like one would be specific for like a home station, another one would be specific for a car or for a digipeater. It's not 100% used, so it might not be the most useful, but you might find that helpful if you want to use some sort of standard. That's the reference that people use. The other point is tactical call signs are allowed. You just have to identify every 10 minutes when you're on the air, right? So as an amateur radio operator, it's not a requisite that your packet itself actually has your call sign in it. It's a requisite that that transmitter identifies itself with its FCC call sign every 10 minutes. So as long as you're accomplishing that somehow, you can transmit your packet differently. So for events, you'll commonly see someone use a tactical call sign like SAG-4, like a support vehicle, or I don't know, police-2 or ambulance-1, or EOC, you know, COOP EOC or something for Cupertino Emergency Operations Center. And that can be really helpful when you're just quickly looking at a map or looking at packets. It'll show up with the actual tactical call sign. If you're running an event or an emergency response, that can be very helpful. So if you're in doubt, if you don't really know what you want to label it as, just start with your call sign -1. That's really easy. So for me, AI6MS -1, or any of the examples here on the screen, perfectly fine, easy way to configure it. There was one question if the automatic information system for Marine and ADSB for aircraft use the same packet format as APRS. No, they use a different packet format, but they are often connected to the APRS IS servers. So if you look at some websites like aprs.fi, they will actually show some of the maritime and aircraft traffic depending on which servers they're pulling from, or you can configure them yourself. Because again, once it's in the servers, it's really just locations and data, and then it's up to you how you want to map that. So you can take data from multiple sources. You can take data from APRS, you can take data from the maritime systems or the aircraft systems as well. So that's kind of fun for people to use. Okay, second one is symbol. This one's great fun. The symbol is just a way that you can put some nice image next to it. So the most common programs that people use to view APRS like on a website or on their program on their computer at home, they'll follow the standard symbol table. Kenneth W6KWF made this nice graphical version that he has posted on his blog. So I stole that here for the presentation. And it's a great way to just choose what kind of station or what kind of symbol you want to use. And there are some fun ones in here, including like a Windows symbol for like the old Windows 95, and you know, a ham radio tower or a bathroom or a hospital or a shopping cart. So these can actually be useful, again, when you're plotting something, especially if you're running like 20 trackers for an event, then it can be really helpful to have different symbols and not necessarily rely on the call signs or something to know what something is. So if it's a motorcycle symbol, it's easy for you to remember, oh, that's one of my chase vehicles. Or if it's a van symbol, oh, that's one of my bicycle vans that's going to for this event to pick up bikes. So that's really helpful. So there are two tables here. There's a backslash and a forward slash. That's the key thing to look at. So if we go to backslash dash, you can see that that would be on this one right here. That would be that second row off to the right. That's the house with the antenna, so that's a ham shack. Forward slash underscore, where's that one hiding? Also right here, so forward slash and then underscore would be this WX symbol, right? And then backslash and T down here at the bottom would be a tornado, right? So just some fun ones. And those actually are used in those areas. So people with storm trackers, they might be sending that tornado data, and you could have an alert set up on your radio or your mobile system saying, hey, there's a tornado within 20 miles of you, be on alert, similar to weather alert on your radio or something that you can set up. If in doubt, you don't know what to use, just pick a car if it's a car, or pick a ham shack if it's a ham shack. There's not really much that you can do here that's wrong, except mark yourself as an emergency. Some people will have these set up to key off of like the fire symbol or the tornado symbol or the hurricane symbols. So I would avoid any of those that have an emergent association to them, and just have them pick one of the ones that's kind of neutral. Be a space shuttle if you like, that'd be kind of fun. Okay, so now we're going to talk about path routing. This is where it gets kind of complicated. The picture in front of you here is kind of normal amateur radio usage, right? So we have two typical modes. One would be simplex, where you're talking to someone else on the same frequency and they talk back to you on the same frequency. If you talk at the same time, neither one of you can hear each other, right? That's doubling. And if you're too far away, you can't hear each other. But if you're in line of sight and you have communications with each other, then simplex works very well. And then there's duplex, where for a repeater, typically you have one input frequency. So that's the blue arrows going into the repeater. That would be what that team would use to speak to the repeater. And then both of these stations listen on the red output frequency. And those are different frequencies. In this case, they're 600 kilohertz apart, right? And that's really important for FM repeater usage, because it can be duplex, where people can, one person can be transmitting and everyone else can be listening at the same time, which is great. For APRS, it's a little bit different. The simplex one is still the same. It still works. If you can directly hear a station for APRS, they can directly hear you. Everything is fine and dandy, and that will just work. But for the repeater usage, the repeaters aren't on duplex. They're still running simplex, and they use something called store and forward. And store and forward is where when you transmit, so if this walking station here transmits, and then the repeater hears him, it will listen, receive that packet, and then as soon as they're done transmitting, it will transmit that packet and send the packet back out, right? So that's a store and forward repeater system. So you don't actually need a lot of the fancy equipment. You can set up a digipeater pretty easily without needing like a duplexer and other expensive equipment. So that's pretty useful. And now the interesting thing with path routing for APRS is that you have full control as the sender of the packet of where it goes. In the normal internet, when you request to go somewhere, the internet, it talks to different types of servers, and those servers decide where to service your request from. In APRS, you select where you want to go and how far you want to go simply by using this wide alias. So there's this wide n-n, so lowercase n dash uppercase n paradigm, which is used to say how many hops you're requesting and how many hops are left, right? So you can say, I want to go 1 hop, and then it'll only allow it to go 1 digipeater. It'll allow it to only go 1 digipeater away, or you could request 2 hops, and then it would go 2 digipeaters away. And you can see that this can become a problem very quickly. If someone requests 99 digipeaters, it will keep hopping for quite a while. So in the United States, for example, if I transmit from near the Mount Diablo, for example, using this Radio Club's example, 1 hop will get me to a digipeater on Mount Diablo, and any station that can hear Mount Diablo will have that hop. That's just 1 hop, right? So 1 hop, if Mount Diablo hears you and digipeats you, means pretty much everyone in the Central Valley will hear you, pretty much everyone in the Bay Area will hear you, and everyone over in the East Bay will definitely hear you, right? Now, if you do 2 hops, then any mountaintop that can hear Mount Diablo will now do a 2nd hop. So let's use an example that, I don't know, maybe one of the mountaintops up in the Sierra Nevada can hear Mount Diablo directly. Very, very, for sure they can do that, right? So maybe something up near Truckee or up in the mountains near Tahoe. So if one of those hears you and you have 2 hops, now you went from wherever you were in Lamarinda, let's say, you went up to Mount Diablo, and then you went from Mount Diablo to Truckee, and your 2nd hop now hits half of Nevada, right? So with just 2 hops, you already went, a good chunk of the way across the United States. And if you set 4 or 5 hops, you would immediately cover all of North America, and you can see how interesting that becomes. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is it's not just that one station that hears you, it's all of these stations hear you, and if they choose to digipeat your signal, or if you ask them to, they may act on it, in which case that 2nd hop is actually Mount Diablo triggers 30 other repeaters in California, digipeaters, to all digipeat your packet as well then. So you just keyed up hundreds of repeaters probably by the end of your 2nd hop. So with great power comes great responsibility, as some wise people often say. So in doubt, set yourself to a lower packet. So this looks kind of weird. This wide 1-1 or wide 2-1 is kind of the standard format that is accepted for mobile stations. And you say, well, Marcel, that 2nd one is actually requesting 2 hops, but only 1 left. What does that mean? Well, that's because when they invented APRS and when we actually started using it and how the networks kind of developed, this is kind of the corner that we ended up in. So the first one is kind of the local repeaters, the local digis, the wide 1-1, they'll hear you. And then the wide 2.1 is saying, okay, any large high-level repeater will then digipeat me. So if we look at this in practice, this yellow beacon here, this will be us, and we'll transmit our wide 1.1, wide 2.1, and two different digipeaters will actually hear us, right? Because I happen to be in range of two digipeaters. So Digi A will hear me, and it will deprecate this wide 1.1 slot and add its own call sign in there. So in this case, Digi A with a little asterisk, and that says this path has been used up. And then it will retransmit the packet with just the wide 2.1 left. And in this case, it made it to an iGate, and then that iGate will put this packet on the internet as is, which is great. So I can go on the website and go find it. Now, the same packet also was heard by Digipeater B, and Digipeater B did the same thing where it removed that first one and added its own call sign, DigiB with an asterisk, and then retransmitted that packet with wide 2-1 to DigiC, right? And now DigiC removed that second routing path and added its call sign. So now we can see that this packet's gone through DigiB and through DigiC, and then it gets repeated out. So you can see kind of this progression of the packet moving through the system, and each of these path, like tokens, if you will, gets used up and then moves on from there. And to Hella's question in the chat, yes, absolutely. The question was, when hopping, can a packet return to previous digipeaters? And the answer is yes, right? So fundamentally, when Digi B transmitted, Digi A probably heard that packet as well. So Digi A actually got this packet here, the Digi B-Y21 packet. Now, if Digi A was programmed to retransmit that packet and then delete the wide 2.1, then that packet would again propagate over here a second time. Now, most digipeaters are configured to not propagate a packet from the same call sign with the same content within a certain time frame. So like within 30 seconds or with a minute or something, they'll be programmed to not repeat something repeatedly. Otherwise, it'll sit there and just repeat, and these call signs will just keep bouncing back and forth between all these different stations, right? So that's where it's really important that the owners and operators of the digipeaters, I think Jim raised his hand earlier and a couple other folks on the call, how they configure the digipeater to actually operate and be used is really critical to make sure that you don't blow up the network. It'll frequently happen that someone, we'll get that example later, that one's fun, but yeah. Okay, so that's path routing. So we talked about the common routing paths for urban mobile stations, right? We had this wide 1.1, that's the local one first, so that would go to this low-level repeater, and then a wide 2.1, so higher-level repeaters, so like something on top of Mount Diablo, would respond to that wide 2-1 routing. For a fixed station, so if you're like at a base station or a weather station at home, you really don't need that local one because the high-level digipeater can hear you directly usually. So if you're in range of a high-level digipeater, if your house is near Mount Diablo, for example, then you don't need to send the low-level packet and waste the smaller low-level digipeaters resources and airtime by using that up. So you can just send it directly to the high ones. And then my favorite one is the balloon or rocket, and the answer is none. And you say, well, Marcel, I need to be able to find my balloon or rocket when it lands, and I need to be able to know exactly where it is within milliseconds in the air and where exactly it lands. And I say, yes, that's wonderful, but when your rocket is at 100,000 feet, how many digipeaters can hear your rocket at 100,000 feet or balloon at 100,000 feet? Well, if you're over California and your event horizon, I don't know how far out that horizon would be, a couple hundred miles, that's a lot of digipeaters that you can hear. So your first packet with no routing would already activate, I don't know, say 50, maybe 100 digipeaters, depending on how many people, right? If you had all of those hear your first packet, they would all rebroadcast that one packet a second time. So you'd say, here I am, and then 100 people would shout back at you, here you are, right? And none of them would hear each other. And if you had 2 hops, you would light up the entire West Coast with every hop. And typically balloons and rockets are transmitting much quicker than normal because, again, they're moving very quickly, so you want to have more frequent updates. So if they're beaconing every 30 seconds, a packet won't even have made it all the way through the network in that time frame necessarily. So the network would literally get completely jammed up. So you'll actually see that pretty regularly, that when a rocket launch or a balloon launch happens from some group and they configure their tracker wrong, they'll actually take down like the West Coast APRS network for 20, 30 minutes or an hour, depending on how long their balloon's up in the air, until it comes back down and it becomes low level again, and then it's no longer impacting so many stations. So that's just a fun one. So when in doubt, wide 1.1, wide 2.1, and you'll generally be okay. Cool. Next part, packet intervals. So this is the one we kind of just talked about, but it's how often do I need to send my packet? And we'll do another little demonstration here. I'll turn down the volume a little bit more because I think some people were a little bit frustrated by the sound last time. So prepare yourselves. This audio recording is from the standard APRS recording. It was an actual live recording from the Los Angeles area a number of years ago, and it's used for training your TNC algorithms and seeing how good they are. So people will use this standard, I think it's like a 40-minute tape or something, and see how many packets they can decode in that tape reliably. And that effectively tells you how good that system was at decoding packets. So this is what it sounds like in Los Angeles on a typical summer evening. All right, how many packets did you hear in there? Hold up your fingers. 5? Sure. I don't actually remember how many are in this one. It's probably a lot. But you can see that just in that short amount of time frame, there was almost no dead air time, right? It was one preamble to the packet, to the next preamble, to the next packet, just go, 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 go. Some of those would have been a digipeater repeating a signal back. Some of those were the same station transmitting maybe a second time too quickly. And that kind of really depends. So one more time, just for a good measure, because it's kind of interesting to hear this. Yeah. So I think it sounded like 5 packets, so I think that sounds about right. There's often ones in the background, and it kind of depends how many other stations maybe heard it at the same time, so that can get kind of interesting. So how often you need to send your packet really depends on what you are and what you're trying to accomplish, right? So whether you're mobile, whether you're a weather station, whether you're a digipeater, whether you're a balloon, a rocket, etc. Kind of rules of thumb that I kind of put out to be accepted and kind of have come from other groups. If you're a fixed station, generally, you don't need to really transmit anything more than every 10 minutes, probably less, honestly. So if you're just a fixed station that's just saying, I'm here, every 30 minutes or every hour is probably sufficient, or maybe even less. There's no reason to clog up the air. You don't need to tell us that your ham shack is here every 60 seconds. That's completely useless because your ham shack's not moving. It was the same spot it was 60 seconds ago, right? So sorry for methods. So yeah, but if you're a weather station, you might want to repeat a little bit faster, but still not, the weather's not going to change that significantly. But you could also have these change intelligently based on what sort of conditions you're in, right? So if your weather station suddenly got very windy and you wanted higher granularity, you could have it transmit every couple minutes, every 5 or 10 minutes instead of every 30 minutes or an hour if the weather's not changing quickly. So when there are different methods, we kind of talk about 4 different methods. The first one is just purely fixed, and this is you're going to have a fixed time frame from the time that the digipeater, or sorry, that the transmitter turned on. So for example, every 600 seconds from the time that you turned on this transmitter. That can be, if it's exactly 600 seconds, you can actually run into problems that other stations that also set exactly 600 seconds. If you happen to turn on at the exact same time, you'll both transmit at the exact same time every 600 seconds if you're on GPS clock for eternity, right? So people often recommend pick a random number that's slightly above or slightly below, maybe a prime number or something, so that they multiplying factors don't line up and you're less likely to land on top of exactly another station every time. So that can be just something to think about. So don't transmit like exactly on 12 o'clock every 10 minutes. Otherwise, you'll probably collide with a lot of other stations. The second method is a very interesting method. This is called time slotting. And time slotting is saying that you transmit on a fixed interval, but starting from a specific time point or a time slot. And this is incredibly useful if you're setting up your own APRS network with a whole bunch of stations, because then you could have all your stations on, let's say, a 300-second interval, and say, okay, for all these stations with a 300-second interval, I'm going to start them 10 seconds apart from each other. So you could have 30 stations then, all with a 300-second update, transmitting reliably every 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, you'll have a new station transmit, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and then 300 seconds later, it'll restart on that exact same sequence. And they're all GPS synchronized, so that slotting would work really well. So that's kind of great. The other one is dithered, which is kind of similar to what I was saying with the fixed one where you'd pick a weird number. You can have your transmitter actually pick a random number of seconds up or down from 600 to avoid that kind of collision problem. So that's a randomization or a dithering that some systems have to help avoid these packets from colliding with each other. And then ideally, your system has something called smart beaconing. This is an algorithm that some hams developed to help work with stations that change their speed and change their direction, things like cars and motorcycles and any sort of vehicle. And this allows you to change how quickly you're transmitting based on how fast you're going, and if you turn a corner, for example, so that your map, if you're driving on a windy mountain road, instead of having a straight line of dots potentially, depending on what your sequencing was, you could have it, every time you turned a corner, it would put a dot right at that corner so that it knew where you were and that it would nicely map out where you went. So that's really nice for smart beaconing. And that will then change. So you can set, don't ever transmit more than every 30 seconds. There's really no reason for that. And then have the transmit rate change from, this is not a great example here, but every 5-minute transmit interval if you're moving very slowly because you're not moving very far. And as you go up in speed and you're going, I don't know, on the freeway, maybe you'll transmit every 3 minutes or something, or every 2 minutes because you're moving faster and covering more ground. If in doubt, 15 to 30 minutes for weather stations is probably fine, and turn on smart beaconing for your mobile station. Otherwise, set it to something greater than 15 minutes. So that's kind of my rule of thumb. If you don't know what to set it to, do that. The question from Andy, since we have one here, when I mentioned my own APRS network, how would you differentiate your network from the rest of the system? The short answer is you have to use a different frequency pretty much. Otherwise, if you're on the national frequency, so 144.39, everyone else will also hear your packets and transmit your packets. When we use time slotting at the Wildfire Triathlon, for example, we set up on 144.99, which is the alternate frequency for APRS. And there aren't a lot of users on there, though you do have to check to see if in the area you're in, if there's anyone else that's using that frequency and you're planning on utilizing the channel fully, that you make sure you isolate yourself from the network clearly. So in our case, we're kind of out in the middle of Central California, and 144.99 is nice and empty there, and we can even have some higher level Digipeaters that don't have any interference issues, and then the whole network is pretty much ours. So we control all the transmitters, we can program them all how we like, and we control all the Digipeaters, so we can really optimize the system. I think one year we had, I think it was like 3 dozen transmitters and 6 Digipeaters, and we had updates from every single station every 90 seconds about. So we had a 90-second time slotting system. So every 1.5 minutes, you had an update from where all 30 stations were around the lake for the triathlon. Really, really impressive and works great. So if you have it all set up, it's a ton of work to set that up and make sure everything's configured correctly. And of course, with different systems, some systems are easier to configure than others and just don't work as well, or don't support smart beaconing, for example, or don't support time slotting, and then you have to randomize them and fill them into the blank spots and hope that they don't collide, right? So that's kind of, there's some luck involved in that element. Okay, and then the last section, don't worry for this part, we'll take a little break, is the message content or the information field. And this really depends on what sort of packet you're sending, what's going to be in here. So for a position packet, obviously your position's in there, so your latitude and longitude. You may also include your heading and your speed. You might include the radio frequency that you're on if you're using one of your mobile radios. You might include your position, your repeaters information, or the club meeting info if that's just a fixed position packet, or some other free-form text, right? If you're using a website, website or call sign info, if you're using tactical call signs, you would usually include your amateur radio call sign in this message field, the information field, just to ID every packet. Because if you're not necessarily IDing every 10 minutes, otherwise you have to figure out how to do that. So the easiest way is just put that into each packet and just bury it in the message content. So that's perfectly fine. For a message packet, that's something that you can use to actually send text messages or remote commands to stations. And that would not include the position information and the heading and the radio frequency and stuff, but you can just send it as a message packet. So it's a different format. You say it, hey, this is a message packet. It gives you a certain amount of characters that you can use to send text messages. Hey, I'm picking up pizza. What type of pizza do you want? Or remote commands, and you can actually send commands to your station. So if you have like remote HF station, you can actually use APRS to control it, or you can send commands to your Digipeater to remotely configure it or turn it on or off or that sort of thing. So it's a really handy feature that you can use. And then the last two are kind of similar, a telemetry packet or weather packet. Telemetry, depending on the system you're using, can be like a whole bunch of voltages if you're measuring different battery banks or solar panels, or like the door status that we talked about earlier. And then for your weather packet, that one obviously would be temperature, humidity, wind direction, any factors like that, depending on what your weather station has. Alrighty, question break, take a deep breath. That's the big chunk in part 2. This image is kind of fun. You can drop your questions into the chat. This image is fun. This is a APRS track from a road trip that I took a number of years ago with my dad out to Las Vegas. And we had the FTM 350 radio from Yaesu running in the car. And you can see it's really interesting. We had smart beaconing running, right? So running down I-5, you can see a pretty regular interval of packets with a couple, ones packets that were lost because they weren't heard, right? They were probably collided or they didn't make it to an I-gate. Right? They have to make it to an I-gate to show up on this map on the internet. Through Tehachapi, there was a nice set of Digipeaters through the mountains there, and then a big gap here, and then a massive gap when you went through the Death Valley area. And then it got better once you came back out into Nevada when they had a bunch of Digipeaters there. So depending on which region you're in, if there's no Digipeater to provide coverage, like north of Paso Robles here, that's a big gap. That used to have a Digipeater run actually by the Cal Poly Amateur Radio Club. That's unfortunately no more because we lost access to the site. But there are groups that are trying to put up digis to cover different areas, right? And remember, these are all put up by volunteers because we're all amateurs. So that's kind of neat. There's a question, any good how-to guides for telemetry and weather? Yeah, there's a lot on YouTube. There are a couple of getting started guides. I'll get to a website towards the end from Margin Data Systems and Pete Brothers. Those are the two common weather stations that a lot of APRS users have. They have a lot of guides for using for that as well. Another question, is an I-gate bidirectional? If so, what sign of security issues do you run into? Great question, Hella. It depends is the short answer. So in the basic sense, an I-gate is just a receive-only station that would receive packets, so it's just listening, and then it's sending it to the internet. Very similar to people like scanners or people that listen to the police scanners or the aircraft scanners, and they stream those to the internet. An I-gate is a very similar kind of concept. Now, there are instances of what's known as an RF gate, where that I-gate also transmits out, and that's where it becomes very critical that you configure your station correctly, because the ultimate question is what stations what should you RF gate, right? Because the only things you should RF gate, in theory, if this is for local situational awareness, is something that you heard locally. But if you heard it locally, there's no reason for you to retransmit it, right? So RF gating has to be done very carefully with a very specific purpose, right? Maybe you have two communities that like to share their information with each other, or they're sending messages to each other. So maybe you allow messages. If there's a message that comes into APRS-IS that is going to a station that's in your region, maybe you send that packet from the internet out to that zone so that they can receive it based on where they're at, right? But that has to be done very carefully. And again, that's fully up to the configuration of that person that runs that I-gate. And that I-gate now in an RF gate perspective, where they're actually transmitting out, that's their call sign then that's on the hook to make sure that they're sending the right type of information. But that's kind of neat. You can actually send emails to certain servers, and they'll find you on the network effectively and send that packet to there and try to get it back to you. Or you can send a text message and get an APRS beacon back, or you can send an email from an APRS beacon if you send it to the right station through the internet. So that's pretty cool. One more question with APRS, you do not establish a connection with a distant station. Yes, okay, so that's a good point. So with APRS, the packet, so Trevor, WA6JAU, is saying APRS, the packet format is something that you're not actually connecting to another station. So for typical amateur radio packet operations, you're usually connecting to a server on the other end. You establish a connection very similar to a dial-up modem, and then you're transmitting and sharing information, and then you're disconnecting from that station. For APRS, it's using what's known as an Aloha system. You don't actually establish a connection. You're just saying, hello, world, here's where I am. So you're just sending your packet out to the world and telling it how far you want it to fly and hoping that someone will listen to it and acts on that. right? So it's very much a, I hope you heard me, I hope you heard me, I hope you heard me as you're driving around down the Central Valley, right? And then the other reminder that Trevor wanted me to say here is a reminder to not send APRS packets through voice repeaters. That's usually not very friendly because everyone else will also hear that lovely noise that we played earlier, nice and loud on their radios wherever they are at. So for the 14706 repeater, make sure you don't have APRS on your radio when you're on that frequency. So generally advise, follow the band plans. You can find those on APRL's website. And for APRS specifically, if you're trying to talk to other people, use 14439. If you're not trying to talk to other people, pick one of the packet frequencies. You can use the alternate 14499 or find some other packet frequency that you can use for that. Cool. All right, yeah, 2 quick slides before we go to the next section. This is just a typical configuration screen. This is from Argent Data Systems Open Tracker system. So one of these little boxes, to configure it, that's one screen worth of configuration. So that's why you can see that's why this talk exists, is to help you kind of work through that. So we talked about call sign, we talked about path, we talked about symbol, we talked about text, and then we talked about transmission control that's here. So smart beaconing, time slotting, and transmitting. Those are the basics that you need. And there are a lot of help guides depending on the specific model that you buy to help you figure out how to configure that. Here's, again, that W6TDM2 repeater. So that's the repeater down in Cupertino. And we transmit its location. And you can see these are some of the packets that we heard locally. We only transmit wide 1.1 because it's a local packet, so we don't really need to go anywhere else. And this station here, N6ACK-11, that's some gentleman over in Santa Clara, and he's got a Digipeater. That's that an iGate, that I star, that green iGate, that can hear us directly. So you can see that's about the range that we get reliably, and that gentleman pretty typically is repeating our packet. And in this case, we have 2 packets that are 1 second apart. The first one is the location packet with the readable text for the voltage, temperature, and our website. And then the second packet is our telemetry packet. You can see the T here with a number, that's the telemetry sequence. And these are the actual telemetry values that you can then use to graph it out. I've got some examples at the end of the presentation. That's kind of cool. It's a great way to see it. And you can see it pop up here. This is, again, the APRS.fi website. So that's Foxtrot India. It's in Finland. And they run a really nice web interface to looking at APRS packets. All right, part 3. This is where we talk about how you can actually get started with APRS. So we'll go through kind of a couple different ways of tracking things and figuring out what makes the most sense for you. So first, tracking your vehicle. We'll start with that one. It's pretty easy. Track yourself, track anything, talk about some weather stations, and then talk about a couple other fun examples of things that you can do. So we'll start with track your vehicle. The easiest way to do this is to buy a mobile radio that has APRS features built into it. That's just by far the easiest solution. So I believe these are still all current. The pricing is from a year ago or so, but you get the idea. Kenwood and Yaesu both make a number of APRS configured mobile radios. Some of these are very nice ones, like the D710 from Kenwood or the FTM 400. Very nice little radios, top of the line dual band, and they have APRS built in. So you just read the manual and configure those settings, and they work great. Single banders are often cheaper, or sorry, single channel. So the FTM 100 DR gives you that option in a nice smaller form factor. And a lot of these also do messaging, but you kind of have to be careful, right? Messaging in a mobile sense is not advised and not covered in California law for sure. So you do it while you're stationary. You can actually text from the keypad with like T9 where you press multiple times on the different characters, or you have to kind of scroll one letter at a time and hit enter and hit enter and hit enter to type out a character. It's not very feasible. Some of these you can plug in external inputs to, but it's not the best. So I wouldn't necessarily strongly advise that. But the configuration is pretty straightforward, right? Like we said, set your call sign, your SSID. So your call sign -1, set the symbol to whatever kind of vehicle you're in. You can pick car, van, or pickup truck, motorcycle, whatever you like. Then set that path depending on what you want. If you just want to keep it local, wide 1.1, or if you want to, cover a wider area, then you can add that wide 2.1 packet as well. Definitely turn on smart beaconing if you have it. And then some fun alternate options. So the frequency option I really, really like. So if I'm doing a road trip, for example, I'll often have my repeater, my radio on the APRS frequency, beaconing with APRS on the APRS side, and then turn that volume all the way down so it's not squawking in my ear all the time. And then I'll have the national calling frequency 14652 on the second half of the radio. And then my FTM 350 has a nice feature where you can actually tell it to put the frequency of the other half of the radio into the packet so that people know what frequency you're on. So if I'm on a different repeater, for example, as I'm driving, it will tell them, hey, this AI6MS-1 is on this frequency. And if you happen to have the same radio from the same brand as the person who transmitted it, you can click one button and say, switch to this person's frequency. That's really cool. And then you can immediately start talking to them. You can just call up and say, hey, AI6MS, this is W6TDM, I want to talk to you. And that's really cool. So that, unfortunately, it's not well standardized, so the different manufacturers don't implement it the same way. You can still see the frequency, but the actual switch to this frequency button only works if they're the same radio, as far as I know. I don't think they've updated that recently. So that's kind of neat. For tracking yourself, this one's kind of useful. A lot of little handheld radios have APRS built in, which is great. So for around the same price as a mobile radio, you can get a very nice handheld radio with a built-in GPS, a beautiful color screen. Some of these even have cameras built into the hand mic so you can send images. But a number of these also have kind of the same basic features. But it's great because you can just clip it to your belt and walk around. What you'll actually often see is hikers will buy one of these handheld radios and have them clipped to their backpack when they're hiking. And their car that's parked at the trailhead, they'll have configured as a Digipeater temporarily. So they'll leave the radio on in their car and then turn on a Digipeater mode, because a lot of those will have a Digipeater mode. And then their low power handheld will bounce off of their car and then go up to the repeater and make sure that people know where they're hiking around. So search and rescue teams actually use that. And it's very similar to crossband repeating, which some people are familiar with how the crossband repeater in your car can kind of retransmit your signal a little bit further. So that's pretty useful. And these do messaging as well. And of course, on a handheld, it's kind of the same thing. It's a little bit clunky, but it actually can work kind of effectively for short little messages if you're not talking to each other by voice already, right? But you could send packets further away to someone that's maybe not line of sight to you, that can't talk to you on the same channel. And yeah, same basic configuration. So if you're configuring yourself, again, call sign plus SSID, that's the easy part. You set your symbol to probably a person walking or something, or maybe a bicycle or a hiker symbol. Your path depends on your application. So if you're just in an urban environment and you just need locally people to know where you're at, just pick the shortest path. I kind of compare this to the power level that you set in amateur radio. They always tell you, use the least amount of power you need to make the transmission. Similarly, in APRS, use the shortest path that you need to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. If you don't need to talk to the entire Western United States, don't, right? Just talk on the local repeater or talk on simplex, right? So wide 1.1 is a way to talk locally. Wide 1.1, wide 2.1 is like talking on your local repeater, and then wide 1.1 and wide 2.2 is like trying to talk as far away as possible if you're out in the boonies somewhere and you really need that second hop to get to NIGATE. So if you're driving through Death Valley, for example, or the middle of Nevada, maybe it's appropriate to add an extra hop just to make sure that you are heard if you're using it for telling your family where you are and they might need to be able to find you or something. And then your interval, again, kind of depends. Some handhelds have smart beaconing set up. Otherwise, you might just set it up for, I don't know, every 5 or 10 minutes. If you're hiking, you're not going to make it very far. You might want to preserve batteries, so you might set it to a shorter amount of time, that sort of thing. And then you can track anything. A whole bunch of options out there. Two that I like to call out are from Bionics. It's one of the companies that makes a lot of APRS gear. The MicroTrack AIO, or all-in-one. That's this nice yellow box on the right. It's about $260. You just drop in 8 AA batteries and program it and flip a switch on the inside and throw it anywhere, and it'll just start tracking. So that's what I had on the back of my life jacket on the jet ski in the beginning of the presentation, and that works really well. It's, I think, only 5 watts, but kind of does the job. We put these in ambulances. You can glue some magnets to the side of it and slap it onto the side or top of a car carefully. You might want to tether it as well, just in case. Fun fact, most ambulances are either aluminum or fiberglass on the sides, so you have to find the right spot where you can mount it. And then the other one here is the MicroTrack RTG, or Ready to Go. Same type of thing, but it's very much designed for mobile, right? You can see the cigarette lighter plug here goes straight into the car power. It's got the GPS puck here, the actual radio transmitter, and then a little mag mount that you can throw on the roof. This is a great way if you just want a quick way to get your system on the air and you just care about where you are, not receiving stuff back and doing something with it. These are great ways to just track something. So for events, the Couple Amateur Radio Club purchased a whole bunch of these for some of the events we run and just deploy them because they're really easy to deploy and you can pre-configure them with the right call signs and tacticals and stuff. So that's great. Weather stations, there was a question earlier about the weather stations. The two kind of most common ones are, one is from the Argent Data Systems group, ADS, the WDS1, about 150 bucks. And it comes with this nice little box down below that you just hook up to VHF radio. So it already does the packet handling. It's effectively built into this. And then you just need to hook up the actual RF transmitter. And they sell some neat little packet radios too that you can use with it. Or you can just convert your old HT like this with a cable and then have it hook up to that packet. With that. So there's an old FTM11R from my dad that I hook up to my TNCs. And then Pete Brothers, that's the other one that's very common for APRS. They have a lot of good options. A lot of people use these for their permanent stations at home. They're a little bit more expensive, but they're very, very capable. A lot of people hook them up to their computers and then also put that information on Weather Underground or other websites and kind of join the community of weather stations out there, which is good fun. All right, and then there's the everything else bucket. And this is kind of fun. We talked about it earlier. Really, all you need is this TNC or terminal node controller and a radio, right? Because the TNC will decode those packets, and the radio is what actually talks to the frequency. And then you can hook it up to something else. So you can hook it up to a GPS. You can just, take your TNC like this and buy a GPS puck, and now you have a position reporting system along with your radio. This was my motorcycle tracking system for the longest time, just these three things together. Or you can hook it up to a computer, or you can hook it up to a phone, right? This example here on the right, that's actually a TNC with Bluetooth in it, and you can hook it up to your cell phone and then use your cell phone to view the stations that your radio receives on your cell phone. Or you can take it one step further, which is cheating a little bit, using APRS Droid. That's a app that you can download for your phone, and it uses the mobile data network to just send your packet directly to the APRS IS servers. Right, so if the cell network's up, that works great. And it's actually kind of nice because you can use it to send and receive text messages on APRS through RF gates and I gates that are out there. So that's actually really useful for configuring Digipeaters that you're not in range of. You can send a message out through that client through RF gates to reconfigure your Digipeater or something. So that's a really fun thing to do. And along with this, the TNCs, they're commonly available. You can really just get any TNC and hook it up to radio. The really common ones out there, so the Argent Data Systems, that's N1VG, Scott Miller down in Santa Maria, down in Central California. He's one of the two big companies that makes a bunch of systems. So this is his OT3M. In the bottom right, that's his Tracker 4. That's his brand new one that just came out, I think, last year. That's got a built-in Wi-Fi access point as well, which is pretty neat. I haven't actually played with one yet, but very, very capable. The OT USB, that's probably the cheapest option you can get for just a standalone TNC. Highly recommended. It's 45 bucks, really easy to use, hooks up to your computer, has a nice graphic user interface for programming, really straightforward, so just dead easy to use. And he sells all the cables and the GPSs for using that. And no, he doesn't pay me for this, but I just think they're great and I've been using them for years. Bionics is also very, very good. They make that, I talked about their AIO and RTG earlier, and this is their Tiny Track 4, which is kind of the equivalent, just a standalone TNC. And then Cantronics, so the same TNCs that a lot of people use for packet radio for their ARES use or MCOM use. Those same TNCs function on the same kind of principle, so you can use them just as a terminal node controller and hook them up to a computer and then do the same thing. A lot of Cantronics TNCs are in use as Digipeaters in the world, just because they were very popular for a while. And the GPS pucks are cheap, 70 bucks. They probably come down quite a bit. You can actually get modules as little as $10 or $20 and figure that out. A whole bunch of software available. I won't dig into the details. These are kind of the common 6 that people will use for doing stuff with their computer. So if you're using your TNC, you'll be familiar with this KISS mode, and that's just sending those packets from the TNC to your computer and back. And then there are a whole bunch of different programs that you can use to run these. So people can just run their TNC in KISS mode and then have the actual Digipeater logic. So we talked about that, deciding what to transmit and retransmit and what to RF gate or iGate. You can do that with these different programs. A little plug for APRS here as well. Kenneth has taken over management of that and updating the source code. So he's the maintainer of that system right now, which is also very, very useful. And then a couple fun ones. So there's just last couple slides to end the presentation. Building your own tracker. So this bottom left one, this is a nice ammo can from W6KWF. You can see the Cantronics packet TNC here, and then just a Motorola CDM 1250 radio, VHF radio, and then there on the side there's an antenna port and a GPS port and a power port. So really clean way to set that up. On the right here, this is the tracker that I built a number of years ago. My old call sign's still on there. Just an old FTM 11R with the battery, kind of put it built in a battery saver, so I've got an external battery, or you can hook it up to a car. So that's good fun. We talked briefly about these. So other things, the APRS Droid app, these are some screenshots from that, so you can see it's pretty fun. You can see all the data right on your phone. Those Bluetooth TNCs, and then a couple more. So these are some fun ones. This one I played with a while back. I did actually get given this G-Trans cable to try out. There's a nice wiki page that we wrote up about it. Garmin, the manufacturer of these GPS units, has an interesting protocol called G-Trans, which is used, it's designed for dispatching commercial trucks and like package deliveries groups and that sort of thing. And you can use it for APRS and link it to your Garmin GPS. And as a result, this is an FTM 350 with an old Nuvi 350 GPS unit. And you can see that I can actually have this running in the car, receiving and sending packets through my radio, but then displaying them on the screen, which updates their positions in real time. So it's actually very cool. And I can navigate towards one of these using my GPS unit. So I can click on like WB9BXY, and it's 3.5 miles southeast, or 3.2 miles southeast of where I was, and it would start navigating me towards that location. So that's a great way to just use it and to visualize it, and you can run your normal navigation on top of that. So that's really fun. Just some of the things that you can do with that, so that's pretty cool. And then the last one here, high altitude balloon tracking. So this one's really fun. This little tracker here on the right is a tiny little UHF tracker that M0XER built back in 2004, hooks it up to a lightweight balloon and just lets it fly around the world. And they have it configured to change the frequency that it operates on depending on the country that it's in, because different countries have different standard APRS frequencies. And some of these trackers have actually gone around the world multiple times. I think 3 or 4 times is kind of the record for how many times they've circumnavigated the globe on one balloon, and they just have solar panels that just keep running. So very, very cool to see just what people will do and what all they can use these systems for. So a whole bunch of references. These slides, again, are on my QRZ page, so feel free to read up and enjoy all the things. Some great ham radio workbench podcasts about APRS if you want to do some more deep dives as well, and then a couple other links that you can reference. So that's all I had today. We'll get to some of the questions. So if you had any other questions, go ahead and add them to the chat, and we'll work through these right now. So one comment from Cal, K6VT, just a reminder to everyone, if you're new to APRS and you want an Elmo or someone, a mentor to help you set up, please do reach out to the group and make sure that you don't accidentally configure things wrong. It can be a little bit daunting, just like transmitting on the radio for the first time. If you're configuring one of these stations for the first time, you just want to make sure you do it correctly and that you don't accidentally transmit and like block up the local voice repeater and just annoy a bunch of people. So that's a good thing. Reach out for help. That's why we're all here to help each other. A question from Tony, KJ60HT, who sets the standards for APRS, and are there still different variants? That's a great story. So APRS comes from Mr. Bob Berninga. He runs aprs.org, I believe, and he's the one who originally kind of set the standard. There is an APRS working group, and there's an APRS kind of user group mailing list that kind of goes through and tries to provide some standards for the community. The actual specification is surprisingly broad and allows it is intentionally written very open-ended to allow a lot of flexibility and configurability, and the community has kind of standardized on a number of things. So a lot of the things I talked about in this presentation are some of the standards that generally are agreed upon for how to best operate, like the wide NN paradigm. That's kind of a standard that the amateur radio operators have kind of adopted based on how the networks have developed over time and how that works. So that's something to think about. But there are official published standards. So there's an actual APRS, I think it's 1.1 or something standard that's published, and you can. Kinesthesis is actually a great way to kind of dive into that if you really want to see some of the ambiguities and see how he's kind of decoded it, pun intended, and figure out what's going on there. Question about specific radios and whether or not they have an internal TNC. If a radio has APRS in it, it will have some form of terminal node controller in it. Whether or not you can actually talk to it externally is a valid question. So a radio like the FTM 350 has an internal TNC, of course, because it uses APRS, but there's no way to access it. So you can't hook it up to like a computer. So some people might want to hook up a computer or a laptop as an extra screen when they're in their car or for a mobile kind of setup. But depending on the radio, you might not be able to do that. The Kenwood D700, D710 series does have an interface, so you can actually hook up a computer to the terminal node controller and get those packets directly from the radio and do a lot more with it. So that's actually very powerful that you can play with those two pieces together. And then just a note from Mike, W6MEW, the APRS Droid does not play well with Android 10. I'm not sure, I haven't actually tried it out on Android 10 myself. But yes, compatibility is always a challenge, as with any operating systems, whether it's mobile or a desktop, it can be a challenge. So that looks like it's all the questions in the chat for today. So thank you very much for having me on tonight's call. We'll be uploading the video presentation to my QRZ from this evening. All my talks and stuff are available on there already. And if you're in the Greater Bay Area and need a tower climber, I'm always a volunteer tower climber once this whole lockdown is over. And if you would like me to speak at some other club, if there are guests here, I think, from a couple other clubs, I'm happy to give presentations. Zoom works out very well for all this, and I've actually given a number of these presentations in the last couple of weeks. So hope you enjoyed it, and thank you all very much for coming this evening.
Hey, a little applause for Marcel. How about that? Take your mic off, whatever. But hey, you know, Marcel, appreciate it. And you know, I was looking at the last certificate. It was almost about a year ago, exactly. So I'll email this to you. But I much appreciated, and hopefully you'll come back for more.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Yeah, thank you, Marcel, very much. Any last minute questions or comments? Otherwise, we're ready to shut it down here, guys.